Picture the average day for a human being, about 50,000 years ago. No alarm clock, no commute, no inbox, no performance review. And the assumption most people carry around is that this must have been some kind of miserable, desperate scramble from sunrise to sunset just to avoid dying. That image gets repeated constantly. The brutish, exhausted cave person dragging themselves through endless hours of dangerous, back-breaking survival. But that image is actually wrong, and the more researchers dig into the evidence, the more wrong it becomes. Ancient humans were not working themselves to death. In many ways, they were working far less than you are. What they were doing with the rest of their time is one of the more surprising stories in the entire history of our species. Let's start with the most basic question. How many hours did it actually take to survive before agriculture existed? Anthropologist Marshall Salin spent years studying modern hunter-gatherer groups, including the Kung San of southern Africa and Aboriginal communities in Australia. What he found overturned everything the conventional story assumed. These groups were meeting their nutritional needs in somewhere between 3 and 5 hours of actual foraging per day. Not 8 hours, not 10. 3 to 5. Salins famously called hunter-gatherers the original affluent society, and not because they had more stuff, because they had more time. The idea that ancient life was wall-to-wall survival work is a projection of industrial thinking onto people who had no reason to operate that way. Now, the foraging itself wasn't leisurely. It was skilled, physically demanding, and genuinely dangerous depending on what you were hunting. Men in many groups took on large game, which required tracking, stalking, and close-range confrontation with animals that could kill them. Women typically handled plant gathering, which sounds simpler but was actually a sophisticated practice. Knowing which roots were edible in which season, which berries were safe, where water sources would be during dry months, all of that knowledge took years to build and represented a serious intellectual investment. A woman who knew her landscape well was not just gathering food. She was operating as a living ecological database for her entire group. So what happened during the other 15 or 16 hours of the day? A lot of it was exactly what you'd expect. Sleep, for one thing. Evidence suggests pre-industrial humans slept more than modern people, and their sleep patterns were different. Research on contemporary groups without artificial lighting shows 2 sleep phases separated by a period of quiet wakefulness in the middle of the night. People would wake, lie still, talk softly, and then drift back to sleep. There was no pressure to be unconscious for a solid 8-hour block. Time was not divided into productive and unproductive the way we think about it now. Rest wasn't something you earned. It was just part of the cycle. This segmentation of time and consciousness wasn't passive. It reflected an understanding that rest was active, necessary, and structured differently depending on the season, the weather, and the community's needs. In tropical climates where nighttime temperatures were manageable, some groups might spend considerable time outside their shelters during cooler evening hours. Others might use the quiet waking period in the middle of the night for soft conversation with family members, or for tasks that didn't require daylight. The rhythm of life wasn't synchronized to an external clock. It was synchronized to the body, to weather patterns, and to the seasons. Let's talk about fire, because fire changes everything about how you think about ancient daily life. Controlling fire dates back at least 400,000 years, possibly much further depending on the site. And once you have fire, you have evenings. Before fire, darkness basically ended the day. After fire, it opened a second world. Evenings around the fire became something researchers now believe was one of the most important social technologies in human evolution. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner studied the book Hontsi people of the Kalahari and compared what they talked about during daytime versus firelight. The results were striking. Daytime talk was mostly practical, complaints, food planning, economic exchange. But at night, around the fire, the conversation shifted almost entirely to stories. Stories are not decoration. They're not something ancient humans did because they had nothing better to occupy them. Stories were the mechanism by which knowledge, values, social rules, and group identity got transmitted across generations. A story about a hunt that went wrong encoded survival information. A story about a person who broke a community rule and faced consequences encoded moral expectations. A story about a distant landscape that an elder had seen decades ago encoded geographic knowledge that a younger person might need later. Firelight hours were, in a real sense, the original education system, and the evidence suggests these storytelling sessions could run for hours, sometimes late into the night. Social bonding took up a significant portion of the day as well. Grooming, in the literal physical sense, was a core activity in early human groups, just as it is in primate groups today. Picking through someone's hair, tending wounds, sitting in physical contact with family members. These behaviors weren't trivial. They built and maintained the trust networks that a small group depended on to function. Robin Dunbar, the evolutionary psychologist who proposed what's now called Dunbar's number, argued that as human groups got too large for everyone to groom each other directly,
Language evolved partly as a way to maintain social bonds at scale. Gossip, in other words, was doing the job that grooming used to do. Either way, a big chunk of ancient daily life was spent on maintaining relationships, and that was considered as important as finding food. Children added a whole layer to daily life that often gets left out of the picture. Childhood in hunter-gatherer groups was long by primate standards, and children were not sequestered away from adult activity. They followed adults, watched, imitated, and participated from a very early age. A 5-year-old might be helping sort plant material or learning to tie knots. A 10-year-old might be accompanying older hunters on easier expeditions. This wasn't child labor in any modern sense. It was immersive, unstructured apprenticeship. The learning happened by being present, and adults spent significant time actively demonstrating skills and explaining what they were doing. Teaching was woven into daily activity, rather than separated from it. Toolmaking deserves its own conversation, because the time investment involved was enormous. Napping flint into a usable blade wasn't something you could do quickly or carelessly. A skilled napper producing a hand axe might spend hours working a single stone, and the skill required took years to develop properly. Archaeological sites show evidence of what appear to be teaching spots, places where large amounts of flint debris accumulated alongside both skilled and unskilled strikes, suggesting that more experienced individuals were working alongside beginners. Lithic technology wasn't a side project, it was a craft, and producing and maintaining tools was a recurring part of the daily and weekly routine. Now here's something that genuinely surprises people. Play. Not children's play, though that was certainly happening constantly. Adult play. Dancing, music, games, athletic competitions between individuals and groups. Evidence for musical instruments goes back at least 60,000 years, with bone flutes found in multiple sites across Europe. Red ochre pigment has been found at sites over 100,000 years old, and many researchers believe it was used for body decoration and ceremony. These aren't the behaviors of a population too exhausted and desperate to do anything but survive. These are behaviors that require surplus time, a stable enough situation to be able to invest energy in things that aren't strictly about calories. Let's talk about ceremony and ritual, because the time investment there was substantial. Sites like Blombos Cave in South Africa show evidence of deliberate, complex symbolic behavior dating back 75,000 years. Shells drilled for use as beads, geometric patterns engraved on ochre, objects that had no obvious utilitarian function but were clearly treated with care. Ritual practice in small-scale societies typically involves extended preparation, repeated performance, and significant communal participation. These aren't quick 5-minute activities. A burial ceremony, a coming-of-age ritual, a seasonal gathering, all of these could occupy entire days and involve the whole group. The archaeological record suggests that some ritual sites were revisited repeatedly across generations, locations that held particular significance for groups. These might have been burial grounds, reliable water sources with ceremonial importance, or places where multiple groups aggregated at particular times of year. The preparation and execution of rituals, the carving and maintenance of objects, and the teaching of ritual knowledge to younger community members represented a significant investment of human effort and cognitive capacity. This wasn't surplus energy being spent frivolously. It was how communities maintained their identity and cohesion. Travel also consumed far more time than modern people typically imagine. Hunter-gatherer groups moved regularly, following seasonal resources across large territories. The Kungsan, for example, covered territories ranging from roughly 400 to 600 square miles. Moving camp isn't instantaneous. It means packing everything, walking significant distances with children and elderly family members, scouting new locations, and setting up again from scratch. Groups might move camp dozens of times per year. Travel days weren't work-free, but they were different work, not economic production in any sense we'd recognize. What about trading and long-distance exchange? This one catches people off guard. Archaeological evidence shows that materials like obsidian and certain shell types were moving hundreds of miles between groups long before civilization in any conventional sense existed. That kind of exchange doesn't happen without contact, communication, and some kind of relationship. Groups met at seasonal aggregations at reliable water sources, at shared hunting grounds. These meetings involved negotiation, gift exchange, arranged marriages, and probably the kind of multi-day socializing that looks, from the outside, very much like a festival. They weren't just trading rocks. They were maintaining the social infrastructure that made cooperation across distance possible. Healing and medical practice absorbed significant daily attention too. Humans were dealing with injuries, infections, parasites, difficult childbirth, and chronic conditions with no pharmaceutical industry backing them up. But they weren't helpless. Ethnobotanical research on living hunter-gatherer groups documents hundreds of plant-based treatments passed down through careful observation over generations. Someone had to gather and prepare those plants. Someone had to care for the sick person, monitor their condition, and adjust treatment. The person doing that work, usually an older woman with deep plant knowledge or a designated healer figure, was putting in real time and real expertise. Medicine existed. It was just organized differently. And then there's something harder to categorize, but genuinely important. Thinking, observation. What looks from the outside like a person sitting still doing nothing. A hunter watching a herd's movement patterns for hours. An elder studying the sky and noting how the stars shift across seasons. A woman sitting by a riverbank figuring out which plants grow near water in late summer. This kind of slow, patient attention was how knowledge accumulated. It didn't produce an immediate visible output, but it was the engine behind everything else, the source of the ecological expertise, the navigational knowledge, the understanding of animal behavior that made sustained survival in a given landscape actually possible. The picture that emerges when you put all of this together is very different from the exhausted caveman version. Ancient humans before farming had significant free time, strong social networks, rich creative and ceremonial lives, and a deep investment in skills that took years to master. What they didn't have was specialization in the modern sense. Nobody was exclusively a hunter, or exclusively a healer, or exclusively a toolmaker. Most adults did most things, and the day moved fluidly between different kinds of activity rather than being carved into discrete work and non-work categories. That flexibility was the whole point. The shift to agriculture around 12,000 years ago is often framed as an unqualified upgrade, and in some ways it was. But skeletal evidence tells a more complicated story. Early agricultural populations show higher rates of dental disease, nutritional deficiencies, repetitive stress injuries, and infectious disease compared to the hunter-gatherer populations that preceded them. The average farmer in the Neolithic was working longer hours on a narrower diet than the average forager had. They gave up variety, flexibility, and time in exchange for the ability to support larger, denser populations. Whether that trade was worth it depends entirely on which values you're optimizing for. What ancient humans did all day before jobs existed was, by almost any measure, a fuller life than the phrase daily survival implies. They foraged, yes. They hunted, yes. But they also played music around fires that burned late into the night, told stories that carried knowledge across generations, spent hours crafting tools to a standard of quality that took years to achieve, traveled vast territories, maintained complex social bonds, and sat quietly watching the world long enough to actually understand it. The idea that meaningful human life began when someone invented a job description is, to put it plainly, backwards. The capacity for all of it was already there, running at full capacity, long before anyone thought to put a wage on any of it,